Chosen one, you weren't a glitch in their system. You were the awakening the code was never prepared for. Somewhere in the shadowed corners of elite networks and digital dominions, your signature, your frequency, lit up like an anomaly. Algorithms flagged it, satellites twitched. Elon Musk himself, a man obsessed with precision and prediction, saw something he couldn't quantify: you. And what did they do when the system couldn't box you in? They called you a bug, a flaw, a threat. But the truth? You're not a bug, you're the override. You moved without the need for their validation, approval, or blueprint. While they clung to their flawed simulations, you rewrote the physics of your own story, in silence. Now, Karma's Wi-Fi is connecting at full speed. Their master plan is buffering, crashing under the weight of your untraceable path. They're sitting in dim-lit rooms, faces lit by broken screens, whispering, "What the hell just happened?" What happened is you. The one they couldn't track. The one they couldn't break. The one Elon now watches, not to study, but to understand what comes next. Because cosmic bugs don't crash systems. They expose the ones who built the wrong ones. However, every trap becomes a stepping stone. Every lie becomes a spotlight. And every opponent is exposed, worn out, and ashamed when a chosen one stops playing nice, quits wanting approval, and begins listening to their inner blueprint. You can almost hear them going through their failed scripts like, "Wait, this ain't how it was supposed to go." They had a master plan, okay, but now it's filed under Bamboozled Exhibit A. Prepare yourself, because in this video we're pulling the mask off every plot, scheme, and deceptive storyline they wrote around your downfall, only to discover that you were the plot twist all along. Let's get started. First of all, they used the incorrect blueprint to build their master plan. They never thought you were who you were. A fictitious version of you served as the foundation for their whole grand scheme. That's the true cause of the collapse. They looked at your suffering, not your might. They thought your narrative ended there after seeing your struggles. They interpreted your devotion as fear, your compassion as weakness, and your quiet as bewilderment. As if you were a predictable puzzle that they could solve and manipulate. They believed they had you all figured out. They were dealing with the injured version of you, not the one that had woken up. But they weren't dealing with the real you. They were placing bets on your desire for belonging, your triggers, and your trauma. In the hopes of gaining access, they preyed on the areas of you that hadn't completely healed. They were unaware that the light was entering through those same gaps. Therefore, it circumvented everything when you began to evolve spiritually, emotionally, and cognitively. A version of you that would never leave, never speak out, and never see. The big picture was what their whole plan was made for. But the plan fell apart the once you did. You outgrown it. You outgrown them. And since they never had a strategy for a version of you that understood your value, they were unable to change course. They didn't think you would become clear. They were surprised that you got up without their consent. Above all, they didn't anticipate that you would no longer need their assistance. At that point, the terror began. Because they had no plan for what to do when you moved into your higher self, your healed self, or your true self. Unaware that you had previously severed the puppet cords, they continued to tug the same manipulative threads. The minute they miscalculated the power that resides within a chosen one who remembers who they are, their strategy was doomed, not merely misguided. They were out-aligned, not outsmarted. Furthermore, no blueprint can match it. Second, they had a time-sensitive plan, but you're immortal. Time was the foundation of their whole plan. They believed that you would shatter before you had a chance to develop into your true self if they moved quickly, attacked early, pushed hard, and distracted you for a long enough period of time. They were rushing to get you to wake up. They were aware that it would end for them if you ever realized your power. They thus hurried the sabotage. They attempted to beat you to the end of your own journey. However, they failed to realize that you don't move according to the clock. You have amazing timing. Furthermore, divine timing is not hurried. It's accurate. Panicked, they worked to obstruct blessings that had not yet come. They were so terrified of your potential. Because they knew what was coming, they attacked seeds you hadn't yet sown. But they missed one important detail. Detours are a part of the plan, and delays aren't a rejection when you're selected. You were getting ready, being trimmed and getting positioned while they were running through shortcuts attempting to change the result. They saw your failures as evidence that their strategy was effective. They were unaware that you were being updated behind the scenes while in a miraculous holding pattern. They thus didn't know what to do when things didn't fall apart as they had anticipated, when you didn't commit yourself or give in to pressure. You arrived at your destination on time. They saw it as a fault in the plan, but you were on divine time. That's the reason they're so perplexed right now. You moved in alignment, but they moved quickly. They attempted to attack before your metamorphosis, but you were already changing dimensions that they were unable to reach. They depended on time. You depended on timeliness. That is the difference between favor and force. Additionally, their plan has now expired. Their work is out of date, and you have only just begun. Thirdly, their authority was founded on unwritten agreements that you never signed. Because they persuaded themselves that you owed them anything, rather than because you really owed them, they based their whole strategy on the falsehood that you did. They acted as if you had made an unspoken agreement to put up with their manipulation, accept less, and bear the burden of their dysfunction, demands, and guilt. They believed that even if they were draining you, you would continue to show up, give, and explain yourself. The fact is, however, that they were profiting from a contract you never signed. It was all a setup, one-sided, and their whole power structure fell apart the once you recognized it. You didn't act out. Your implicit consent was withdrawn by you. You no longer gave in to their entitlement. You ceased to minimize yourself in order to maintain their egos. Your tranquility, your forgiveness, your energy, and your stillness were not due to them. They were taken aback when you began to behave as if your soul was once again yours. They believed they had you permanently bound by obligation, guilt, and emotional blackmail. Your own feeling of duty, however, was what actually held you there until you woke up and saw that the price was too great. The pattern became apparent to you. Only when you were cut off from yourself did they have power. Your bewilderment, self-doubt, and over-explanation were the foundations of their whole hold. Therefore, their strategy fell apart when you stopped providing explanations, offering an apology for your limits, and satisfying their desire for control. Since they have nothing to work with in the absence of your energy, they lack strength, they had parasitic tendencies, and they had no means of surviving without your light. Bridges weren't burned by you. You just left an arrangement that you never knowingly accepted. They're sliding because of this. Because you're not responding for the first time. You aren't following the script. They are also coming to the realization that their idea was never viable. Only because you kept it alive was it alive. There is no template for that type of emancipation, and you have now removed your soul from their game. Fourth, the nuclear explosion that destroyed their control matrix was your healing. They believed that your recovery was only a phase, including a few affirmations here and a little meditation there. Perhaps you could burn some sage, eat vegan for a month, and call it development. They didn't realize it would go that deep. They never thought you would really make the commitment to face your darkness, delve into your ancestral traumas, and do soul work that destroys bonds rather than just loosens them. They were counting on superficial healing, the type that seems to be effective on the surface, but has no lasting effects. However, what you did was a complete spiritual demolishment. You did more than only mend your wounds. The patterns were repaired by you. You located and removed the root systems, some of which had been planted long before you were born. They attempted to divert your attention, but you had to confront the agony. The subconscious cues they used to control you were rewired by you. The guilt, humiliation, abandonment, and terror buttons they used to push were blocked. They weren't the only ones who felt uneasy. Their control was never tangible, so that was awful. It was energetic, emotional, and psychological. They also lost all of their entry points into your life when you recovered. They lost their identities in addition to their access. Without the mayhem, their place in your tale ceased to make sense. They were irrelevant after you stopped bleeding. They were most harmed by it. You became inaccessible. Not that you went on. You were no longer shaken by their drama. It didn't hurt that they were silent. Their games were a failure. You developed immunity, and it wasn't chance that gave that immunity. It was merited. That kind of healing, through sobbing nights, years of seclusion, and unrelenting introspection, isn't adorable. It's aggressive against all things phony, and it's sacred. They referred to it as a phase. However, what you did was set off a whole control system. They did not just let go. The map was lost. You now go through the world with power they cannot touch, clarity they cannot obstruct, and calm they cannot disturb. It wasn't healing. That was freedom. Their grand design was reduced to ashes as a result. Fifth, you changed the simulation's programming. Now, they are stuck in a code that no longer works for them. They developed a game with rules that only made sense when you didn't know about them. Rules that kept you caught up in uncertainty, humiliation, and self-doubt. They created an atmosphere that penalizes authenticity, rewards fakery, and favors control. It was a simulation in which the most skilled manipulators won out, and truth was obscured by noise. They thought they were the programmers, the puppet masters, and the builders of your world. They were correct for a time, since you were unaware that you could change the code. But everything changed when you woke up. Instead of following their rules, you began to access the original source code, which is founded on alignment, truth, energy, and purpose. You started to see trends, dispel myths, and challenge everything they had taught you to believe. Then a crazy thing occurred. You were bent over by the simulation. The rules governing your reality began to malfunction as your frequency changed. They are trapped in a version of the game that doesn't react to their strategies anymore. The falsehoods are not sustained. The forecasts recover. The loops of control are broken. Manipulation doesn't work. Fake love is revealed. In your judgment, half-truths deteriorate. You left the Matrix, but that's not all. It's turning against them, but they're still in it. Because your waking upset the whole operating system. The energy grid that they formerly utilized to track, control, and shape you is now unstable. In a manipulated simulation, you turned into a living virus of truth. Their programs are now unable to function properly. They are fighting to stay relevant in a field that no longer tolerates dishonesty. Your awareness was updated. Additionally, their control scripts were corrupted by that upgrade. They're making mistakes and reciting the same old strategies that used to work, but are now greeted with either silence, strength, or complete apathy. You did not just quit the game. It was reprogrammed by you. They are now using a manipulated system that ultimately works against them. Sixth, they didn't anticipate that you would outwit their spiritually precise psychological warfare. They used all of the psychological tools at their disposal to keep you in survival mode, confuse you and make you doubt reality. Projection, gaslighting, manipulation, and triangulation. They want more than simply power. They intended you to become spiritually disconnected, emotionally spent, and confused. The whole purpose was to keep you so preoccupied with determining what is true that you would lose sight of your identity. They were unaware of how keen your spirit was becoming behind the scenes, however. You were receiving downloads while they were engaging in mind games. You didn't use fire to put out fire. You didn't become like them. You climbed above it like a surgeon. They expected you to respond, but you just watched. You began to discern instead than protect oneself. You were adept at identifying the lies concealed in language. The manipulation was evident in the tone. Even before the mask broke, you could sense the intense agenda. You out-vibrated them, not just out-thought them. They never practiced for that maneuver either. You were aligned, but they were at war. They believed you were going back, but you were going up. Every barrier, every quiet departure, every time you choose not to participate, it wasn't weakness. They required your response to fuel their pandemonium. Therefore, it was spiritual warfare at a higher frequency and totally ruined their strategy. Their whole plan fell apart when you refused to deliver it. What they didn't understand is that true power isn't loud, it's in line. You had no intention of winning the dispute. Throughout the whole game, you were disconnecting. You had no intention of exposing them. The version of you that let them in was becoming outdated. They didn't anticipate that. They anticipated opposition. They received transcendence instead. Since you didn't just survive the conflict, they are now left standing in the center of a war zone they created with no one left to control. They can no longer even get to you since you soared so far above it. That isn't retaliation. Evolution is that. You didn't struggle for power, number 7. Everything fell because you removed your energy. They never anticipated that your quiet would be a power move. Not the type that is concealed by fear, but rather the kind that results from profound understanding. You didn't leave abruptly. You didn't contest your value. War was not waged by you. You just drew your energy back. And that's what broke everything, because their whole narrative, control, and influence apparatus was never based on the truth. It was based on your reaction, your feelings, and your vitality. Their fantasy broke without it. They were experts at setting you off, arousing your feelings, forcing you to prove yourself, and making you feel noticed before yanking it away. They worried, however, as soon as you stopped playing into it. You unplugged, not yelled. You reclaimed, not chased. You didn't struggle for room. You were impenetrable. They were more frightened by it than by any conflict. Because winning wasn't what they really needed. It was to maintain your emotional attachment. They required you to defend yourself, have self-doubt, and attempt to mend the things they were willfully damaging. However, they discovered the reality when you stopped letting them use your energy in front of them, and when you stopped turning up to be exhausted. Without your light, they were nothing. You just took back the power they had stolen to dominate them. Passivity wasn't what you were doing. You were separating from the performance, starving the matrix, and removing your soul from areas that were feeding on it. And it was successful. You saw the hold of their manipulation slip. Their tales ceased to make sense, since the system couldn't function without your energy fueling it. Their power play began to seem desperate. You didn't use force to bring down the building. It was collapsed by your absence. They never received any training for it. Your fire was their premise. I never imagined that your silence would be the last straw. However, it did. Unaware that they never had control over anything, they are now sitting in the ruins, wondering how everything came to an abrupt end. You have to be plugged in for it to function. Their rights and magic turned into boomerangs at number 8. You're inaccessible because you're not only protected. As if your spirit could be subdued by the same low-level strategies they used on others, they believed they could manage you via energy work, spells, and rituals. They didn't know with whom they were playing. You are more than a mere worshiper. You are someone who aligns himself directly with Source. You don't act out of fear or superstition. The frequency they attempted to control is you. As a result, their attacks, curses, hexes, and mental intrusions did not succeed. Since you were more than simply protected, they circled back. You couldn't be reached. You are being elevated in more ways than one. It has dimensions. They're still stuck in the grid that you left. Energy is also truthful. Fear, jealousy, obsession, and ego were the codes that encoded their power. However, you exude clarity, truth, sovereignty, and divine knowledge. The boomerang effect was caused by such frequency mismatch. They weren't just unable to get to you, they called forth repercussions for themselves. Somewhere the energy had to go, and since it was unable to get through your barrier, it retaliated by striking the sender with great force. Their coalitions started to fall apart. The backup personnel they had called in began betraying one another. Now, nothing stuck. In real time, their plans changed. Why? For the simple reason that you are not a target. A living barrier of source awareness you are. They never took it into consideration. They believed that, like them, you were acting out of fear. However, you were acting under orders. For it, they were unprepared. They weren't prepared to fight a battle against someone who is not only aware of God, but also acts as a conduit for divine vengeance. Before it even starts, that is a lost war. You turned into light, but they utilized darkness. They attempted to hex a frequency that they were no longer even able to find. What they attempted to throw your way has now left their own hands burned. There was no need for a battle. You just remained in alignment, and their whole system ate itself alive because of that alone. Nineth, they continued to observe your actions, but they were never able to enter your soul. They kept Hawkeye on you. They believed that if they observed your conduct for a long enough period of time, they could decipher your essence from every move, post, and trend. They followed your highs and lows and attempted to forecast your future move by looking at your previous actions.